Intersectionalism, the highest stage of Western Stalinism? Mike MacNair. Introduction. Oxford University in 2017 started to offer a rainbow lanyard with which members of staff and students can carry their university identity cards, a useful device since an increasing number of university and college buildings are now covered by security devices which require you to tap your university card in order to get in. The rainbow symbol, derived from Jesse Jackson's 1984 Rainbow Coalition, has become a symbol used particularly by the LGBT+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans*, etc. movement, but also more generally in its original broad diversity coalition significance. The fact that some sort of lanyard is desirable shows that the university is moving towards being a closed gated community controlled by identity cards. It is not coincidental that this increased security paranoia coincides with the circumstance that Oxford has great difficulty in meeting its O.F.F.A targets for recruiting disadvantaged students, a formula which in itself downplays the extent to which privately educated students, i.e. the very well-off, are overrepresented in Oxford and Cambridge. Admissions. Card access to buildings can also be used to track the movement of staff and students, an idea sold as promoting control of computer misuse, i.e. as an instrument of surveillance intensification. The rainbow lanyard colors this movement of an elite institution into closure and surveillance with the imagery of anti-discrimination. This Oxford development is a trivial symptom of a much larger trend, that intersectionality and anti-discrimination have become watchwords of the political representatives of the ruling class, for use against the left. The attention of the left has been, or should have been, drawn to this phenomenon by two recent and ongoing political phenomena. In the USA, the Clintonista wing of the Democratic Party race-baited and gender-baited the Sanders movement in the 2016 presidential primary campaign, and has continued to do so since. Point 3 in Britain. The victory of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour leadership campaign in 2015 led quickly to accusations that the left was poisoned by sexism among leftists hostile to women MPs from the Labour right, and then to an escalating orchestrated campaign accusing first various leftists, and then more recently Corbyn himself, of antisemitism and the soft racism. Point 5 The left has been so deeply committed to intersectionalist approaches for so long, though the widespread use of the terminology is relatively recent, that it has been to a considerable extent wrong-footed by these accusations. Moreover, endeavors to find alternatives to liberal anti-left intersectionalism have been trapped within the foundational assumptions of what became intersectionalism. My argument in this article is that intersectionalism is essentially founded on the People's Front concepts of the 7th Congress of the Comintern, and on the organizations of the 1921 ban on factions in the Russian Communist Party, which interpreted all organized disagreement as representing class, or other, interest conflicts. Anti-factionalism, implying that there could be no unity without silencing criticism, was indirectly reflected in Georgy Dimitrov's offer at the 7th Congress that the communist parties would self-censor their criticisms of socialist and liberal allies for the sake of unity against the fascists, a policy which became generalized in official communism. On these foundations were overlaid ideas of the exclusive authority of personal experience, derived from 1960s 1970s US leftists' interpretations of the Chinese Communist Party's speaking bitterness technique in its land reform campaigns. Intersectionalism can be called the highest stage of Western Stalinism because it carries the popular frontist project to the point of erasing the significance of the ruling class as a class. It also becomes a justification not merely for party self-censorship, but for generalized censorship regimes in the names of no platforming, safe spaces, and so on, and it logically implies the actual liquidation of any independent workers' or communist party into liberalism, as happened in Britain and Italy in the 1990s, so that by fully adopting intersectionalism, Stalinism disappears as such into a more repressive form of liberalism. The underlying commitments to alliance with the democratic bourgeoisie, meaning pro-capitalist liberals, on Dimitrov, self-censorship, terms, produce in political practice the ability of right-wing populists to portray the left as an elite project. Vote Clinton, get Trump, and so mutatis mutandis, globally. The result is to get actual racists and sexists in power, so that the intersectionalist project is self-defeating on its own terms, of prioritizing gender, race, etc., over class. There is an enormous literature on intersectionality and on what lies behind the term, that is, theories of the relations between gender and class and race and class, to go no wider, in politics and social struggles. I will not address the vast bulk of this literature here, I am concerned merely to show the Stalinist foundational assumptions of intersectionalist politics and hence that it is impossible to oppose effectively the liberals' use of intersectionalism as a stick with which to beat the left, without also breaking with these assumptions. Crenshaw's intersectionality. The term intersectionality was coined by black feminist legal scholar Kimberla Williams Crenshaw. Born 1959, Crenshaw is just a little too young to have been an active participant in the left-wing feminist and/or black movements of the late 1960s and early to mid-1970s. She is in her higher education a child of the opening up of the elite universities in the 1960s-1970s. She got her BA in Africana and Government at Cornell in 1981, JD, law degree, at Harvard in 1984, an LLM, postgraduate law degree, at Wisconsin in 1985, clerked for a senior Wisconsin judge, and got her first teaching job at University of California, Los Angeles in 1986.6. The more widely cited of Crenshaw's early articles is her 1991 Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. 7. Probably more widely cited because the issue of violence against women had become so central to radical feminism in the 1980s, as contrasted with the economic concerns of the 1970s leftists. The core of this article is a complex and careful study of the double oppression aspects of race and gender in the contexts of rape and domestic violence, analyzed in terms of structural intersectionality, political intersectionality, conflicts of organized feminism and organized anti-racism, and representational intersectionality, cultural figures of violence. The article, however, assumes the intersectionality analysis and develops it, rather than initiating it. Crenshaw's first published use of intersectionality earlier was her 1989 Law Review article Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine. Feminist Theory and Anti-Racist Politics 8. The first part of this article is an analysis of court decisions on U.S. anti-discrimination law which allowed employers to argue that they were not discriminating against black women either because they treated white women better, or because they treated black men better. The term intersectionality reflects this specific context. It is taken, not from the relationship between different oppressed sections of society, as it is now commonly understood among activists, but from the intersection, the road junction, reflecting the position of black women as injured by both the racist and the sexist streams of traffic traveling in different directions and colliding. It is perhaps a result of a British academic lawyer's assumptions that I found it surprising that Crenshaw explained these decisions on anti-discrimination law by an intersectional gap in the legislation, rather than as fairly obvious examples of artificial reasoning animated by judicial bias in favor of employers. 9. The second part of the article is addressed to feminist theory. Crenshaw comments that when feminist theory attempts to describe women's experiences through analyzing patriarchy, sexuality, or separate spheres ideology, it often overlooks the role of race. Feminists thus ignore how their own race functions to mitigate some aspects of sexism and, moreover, how it often privileges them over and contributes to the domination of other women. Consequently, feminist theory remains white, and its potential to broaden and deepen its analysis by addressing non-privileged women remains unrealized. The only citation in support of this claim is to the 1982 book, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, edited by Gloria T. Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith and published by Feminist Press cited, p. 139n. 1. As Gloria T. Hull et.al. eds. This form of citation hides behind Hull, who had the most conventional academic career, her co-editors Scott and Smith, who were members of the leftist black feminist Combahee River Collective in the mid-1970s. The form of citation may well be merely the journal's conventions, but it is certain that the appeal to Crenshaw's terminology, and hence the use of her articles as foundational, have the effect of cutting off the linkages of the ideas to 1970s leftism. With it disappears also the splintering of the women's, and black, movements in the 1970s-1980s by sectarian trashing and by competing identity claims. 10. In Crenshaw's account in these articles, intersectionality is primarily the condition of being affected by double forms of oppression, which standard single-issue politics fails to engage. The problem with identity politics is not that it fails to transcend difference, as some critics charge, but rather the opposite, that it frequently conflates or ignores intragroup differences. 11. The problem with this approach is that it tends to preclude the possibility of solidarity. This matters little for a law review article, because radical lawyers are precisely seeking saviors from on high, the judges, to deliver their clients from oppression, not collective action, and hence not requiring solidarity. What intersectionality has become in general is something broader than Crenshaw's use, but still with the same vices. It is a combination of the claim to preemptively and exclusively speak about one's own oppression on the basis of personal experience, and hence to a veto of any collective statement by the larger group which might be taken as adverse to the particular group. Conversely, it implies that every resolution or public statement must engage all sections. And though class may be admitted to the sections, in the sense of admitting that there is a form of discrimination against the working class, the ruling class, and discrimination in favor of the ruling class as such is still made to disappear. Combahee River. The Boston Black feminist Combahee River Collective (CRC) is commonly credited with launching the idea of identity politics in its 1977 statement. But CRC participant Demetta Frazier observed that we never really practiced what people now call identity politics, and Barbara Smith has argued that the reason Combahee's black feminism is so powerful is because it's anti-capitalist. Both quotes come from the 2017 book How We Get Free, which includes the famous 1977 Costa Rican Colónes statement, an introduction by Kianga Yamada Taylor, a younger generation writer, and her interviews with 3 CRC participants, Barbara Smith, her sister Beverly, and Demetta Frazier. And with more recent activist Alicia Garza, one of the initiators of Black Lives Matter. And a comment from historian and activist Barbara Rensby. Combahee River Collective started as the Boston branch of the New York-based National Black Feminist Organization, which formally existed in 1973-1975. And broke from them in the mid-1970s because the Boston group wanted more radical politics. They took the name Combahee River from the 1863 Union Army raid on Combahee Ferry, during the American Civil War, in which a leading role was played by the pre-war Underground Railway organizer Harriet Tubman, and in which black Union troops rescued around 700 slaves. The CRC statement offers in essence a lucidly written combination of ideas about the combined effect of multiple oppressions which were, in fact, widespread in the 1970s left. These ideas were linked to soft Maoist interpretations of labor aristocracy theory, the idea that the bulk of the actual organized working class movement was corrupted by privileges. Without using the terminology, the CRC statement says that we might see our position at the bottom, however. To make a clear leap into revolutionary action, the CRC statement is brief, it is well written, and it has the political authority within the general identity politics paradigm of being written by black women, and some of them lesbians too. This might be enough to have given it its subsequent celebrity and foundational status. But there are also both silences in the statement, and positive elements, which will have made it more widely acceptable. For example, the Maoist left in the US was sharply split by the Boston busing crisis over school segregation of 1974 and after. 16 One might imagine that school segregation would be a matter which was significant to Boston black feminists writing a couple of years later, but the issue is absent from the CRC statement. The CRC statement says that the group are socialists. And Barbara Smith in the interview insists on anti-capitalism, while Demetta Frazier says that she considers herself a socialist with a lot of qualifications. These amount, essentially, to saying that socialism is attractive but an issue for the unforeseeable future, pp. 125-126. But the original statement was already extremely guarded about socialism and Marxism. Although we are in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it applied to the very specific economic relationships he analyzed, we know that his analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as black women. p. 20, but they offer no actual explanation or even illustration of how Marxist theory needed to be extended for this purpose. The statement may be true. But a little earlier in the text we have material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources, p. 20, which is purely Lassaline, the exact claim criticized by Marx in the Critique of the Gotha Program. 17 It is then unsurprising that the next sentence is that we are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. Again, this formula is a commonplace of the feminist left and of the anti-racist left of the period. It should be obvious and anodyne that there are no guarantees possible for anyone from socialist revolution or from any other form of struggle, electoral activity, strikes, single-issue campaigns, building feminist collectives, etc. But this obviousness implies that what CRC were actually implicitly arguing was not the obvious and anodyne point, but something different. Along felons that we will not support a project of socialist revolution, or whatever, that is not explicitly feminist and anti-racist within the meaning that we as a group give to these terms. Beverly Smith in her interview similarly says that, for example, if someone's a socialist, it's only about economics. It's only about work. It's only about material conditions. It's only about capitalism. And it's often only about men. This language of reading down socialism in the CRC statement and Smith's interview is complete nonsense by comparison with the Communist Manifesto, the critique of the Gotha program, Engels' Origins of the Family, and so on. I flag these particular texts because they were neither hard to get hold of, nor inaccessible to read, in the 1970s. And both Barbara Smith and Demita Frazier comment on the amount of reading and movement education which went on in the 1970s. It follows that the vulgarist version of Marxism and socialism in the CRC statement is not a politically innocent result of authorial ignorance. Rather, it is a conscious choice. In this choice, it has a Euro-communist aspect, like dual systems feminism which emerged in the same period, and actually forms part of the transition to neoliberal intersectionality. It is likely that this aspect of the CRC statement has influenced its popularity as a foundation text for black feminism widely used in the U.S. Academy. The interviews with the authors add some background to the statement. I have already referred to references to the educational quality of the 1970s movement. There is more on the CRC's involvement in coalitions, meaning single-issue campaigns of the sort that the Leninist left tends to call united fronts, and local organizing work. And there is more elaboration of how the authors came from their experiences with the white women's movement and white left, and with male-dominated black nationalist groups, to the conclusion that they had to organize separately as black feminists. Barbara Smith says that we were socialists. We were part of the organized left. We were not sectarian. We did not belong to any parties or groups. Both Demita and I have never belonged to any party or organized formation. And because we were black women, our value systems were not shaped primarily by the airless ideological sectarianism of the white European male left. But CRC was itself a small group. It does not seem to occur to her that the refusal of membership in any broader party was itself a form of sect construction. The fourth interview, with Alicia Garza, and the comment by Barbara Rensby, illustrate modern identity politics, not the black women's organization as an element of the broader movement engaged in coalition building, as the three CRC authors describe it, but as demands for leadership and veto. Thus Garza says, for example, we don't just want a seat at the table. We want the table. And we want to decide who is sitting at the table. Laugh, right? And then maybe we want to get rid of the table. It should be obvious that this political method is ultimatistic and hence will lead only to splits, demobilization, and in turn in the absence of solidarity, which it renders impossible dependence on saviors from on high to deliver. Just as the use of Crenshaw's intersectionality draws a line against the earlier politics, so too, in a different way, does the promotion of the CRC statement as representing a radical foundation alternative to liberal versions of intersectionality. But in fact, before there was intersectionality and before there was identity politics, there was already talk of double oppression, triple oppression and the class gender race trilogy. Behind the 1970s left Science and Society, the theoretical journal associated with the Communist Party USA, in its April 2018 issue carries a symposium on intersectionality from Marxist feminist points of view, with short pieces by Hester Eisenstein, Martha E. Gimenez, Barbara Foley, Lisa Vogel, and Shauna A. Russell. Two of the authors in this collection point to the trilogy and ideas of double oppression substantially preceding the USAGB 1970s leftists, and do so particularly in the context of the participation of members of the Communist Party USA in what became the civil rights and women's liberation movement. This involvement has been extensively documented in Kate Wiegand's 2001 book Red Feminism, American Communism and the Making of Women's Liberation. Equally, Assad Haider in his 2018 book Mistaken Identity draws attention to the work of 1960s Maoists Theodore Allen and Noel Ignatieff on race and class. Behind this work in turn, Robin Kelly's book Hammer and Hoey in Alabama Communists in the 1930s shows precursors to what became civil rights, though early Maoist leader Harry Haywood identified a later shift into substituting white guilt maneuvers within the party for actual struggle on race issues within the rightwards moving trade union movement. In fact, behind the work of the C.P.U.S.A. in the 1930s to 60s in turn is a tradition which goes back to the beginnings of the Socialist Party of America. Founded in 1901 as a fusion of smaller groups and in political solidarity with the Second International. The Socialist Party in 1901 could without hesitation demand gender equality in its platform, and could have in that year a serious debate about race. It could also denounce U.S. policy in Puerto Rico, and call the attention of the working class to the fact that our judiciary is but a servile tool in the hands of the capitalist class and hostile to the interests of labor. The party's commitments to gender equality and to anti-racism tended if anything to strengthen over its existence. Though the issue was one which divided right and left in the party, and were unsurprisingly carried over into the early C.P.U.S.A., as Paul Heidemann has shown in his 2018 collection Class Struggle and the Color Line, American Socialism and the Race Question 1900-1930. As Heidemann points out in his introduction, anti-slavery and anti-racism go back still further in the socialist movement, to Marx's writings and to the First International's support for the Union side in the American Civil War. Indeed, one socialist platform Marx was directly concerned in drafting, the 1880 program of the French Parti ouvrier, begins with the claim that l'émancipation de la classe productive est celle de tous les êtres humains sans distinction de sexe, ni de race. The emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race. The problem posed is how the left, in broad terms, has moved from this foundational aspiration to universal human emancipation, to accepting the intersectional idea of coalitions based on sections, white women, black men, black women, workers, and so on, with each section having wholly autonomous, and often opposed, interest claims and veto rights in the coalition process? From universal emancipation to intersectionality. The answer has three elements. The first is that the left itself, led by the CPUSA, moved into asserting the conceptual autonomy of racism, sexism, and so on within the framework of the People's Front. The second is the additional contributions, within that People's Front framework, of U.S. soft Maoism in the 1960s-1970s. The third is the active interventions of capital, its state, and its political representatives, to manage opposition. In particular, a section of the political representatives of capital saw that the model of conceptual autonomy of the trilogy could be deployed to construct a new pro-capitalist coalition structure using anti-discrimination to neuter the workers' movement and the left. And from the mid-1970s this approach became dominant in the U.S. Its subsequent spread is from the U.S. outwards. People's Front, modern identity politics, and intersectionality as an outgrowth of identity politics, begins in a sense with official communism in the period of the People's Front policy, which aimed to resist the threat of fascism by uniting with the democratic wing of capital or Party of Liberty, on terms that the workers' parties would not go beyond what was acceptable to the Party of Liberty. Though it is conventional to refer to the People's Front policy, the texts of the 1934 Seventh Congress of the Comintern also included a reformulation of the United Front. As originally posed by the Comintern in the early 1920s, the United Front idea involved unity in action of the workers' organizations, both independent of the capitalist parties, a principle abandoned in the People's Front idea, and on terms that there would be no suspension of criticism on either side. But Georgy Dimitrov at the 1975 Seventh Congress of the Comintern argued that the communists attack us, say others. But listen, we have repeatedly declared, we shall not attack anyone, whether persons, organizations or parties, standing for the united front of the working class against the class enemy. But at the same time it is our duty, in the interests of the proletariat and its cause, to criticize those persons, organizations and parties that hinder unity of action by the workers. Since then, the acceptance that unity requires suppressing or at least toning down disagreements has been extremely widespread on the left. The history is now largely forgotten, all that is left is a cultural tick of toning down polemic for the sake of unity. The point is not that the CPUSA became for the first time left promoters of feminism and anti-racism in the Popular Front period. It is rather that, as Charlie Post indicates in his study of the CPUSA in this period, the Popular Front policy led them for the first time to treat official women's movement leaders, and official black community leaders, as legitimate representatives of group interests wholly separate from the class interests of the working class, and to begin to elaborate class, gender and race as a trinity. The trinity and the underlying People's Front approach inherently carried with it the idea that the specific interests of workers would be defended by the workers' movement, and that these would be essentially economic, trade union issues, that the specific interests of black people would be defended by the black community and bloc nationalists and community leaders, and that the specific interests of women would be defended by a women's movement and its liberal leadership. It already, therefore, entailed acceptance of the ideas of the Rooseveltian Democrat trade union bureaucrats that gender and race issues, and so on, were not trade union issues, what Lenin in What Is to Be Done called trade unionism and the bourgeois politics of the working class, transcribing an English word into Russian to describe what in 1901-1902 looked like a peculiar British phenomenon. People in the US began in the early 20th century to use the more evocative term business unionism. In theory, the defects of the various single-issue operations recommended trade unions for worker issues, women's groups for women's issues and so on would have their defects made up for by the role of the party. However, in reality the concepts of the United Front and of the People's Front defended at the 1935 Seventh Congress oft Comintern were, as Dimitrov, quoted above, explained, predicated on the party actually self-censoring in order to maintain unity. The logical consequence would be that the party could not substitute for the economism of the unions, for the pure feminism of women's groups, and so on. The logic of the policy was thus, precisely, to drive the issues of class, gender, and race apart, rather than to pull them together. The consequence was, in turn, that the party's primary self-censorship drives would focus on protecting relations with the party's most powerful imagined potential allies, the trade union bureaucracy and the Rooseveltian Democrats. This in turn would necessarily push women and black activists towards oppositional and independent policies and the rejection of the party itself. It was in this context that soft versions of Maoism emerged in the later 1960s, aimed at borrowing what were seen as creative Maoist ideas rather than creating definite Beijing-line anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist parties. Maoist contributions. The Maoists retained the People's Front idea but brought to the orientation two further elements, speaking bitterness or consciousness raising, and a hardened concept of labor aristocracy as an irredeemable privileged caste. Speaking bitterness was a Maoist technique of mobilization and political education and land reform campaigns through drawing on peasants' personal experience. It was popularized in the West by William Hinton's Fanchon, published in 1966, and was adopted in an adapted form as women's liberation consciousness raising. Speaking bitterness/consciousness raising carried with it the corollary that personal experience was to be the only guarantee of veracity. This has the consequence, as Adolph Reed Jr. pointed out in relation to Jesse Jackson, and continues to point out in relation to the black leaders of the 2010s, that there can be no criterion of political trustworthiness other than authenticity of position, as woman, as black, and so on, and as a result mountebanks and agents of the establishment can set themselves up as leaders of the interest groups. TERF wars no platforming arguments about who counts as a woman to speak as such provide another example of the destructiveness of the method, the point being that if legitimate speech grows out of personal experience, whose experience is sufficiently legitimate for their speech to be legitimate? The issue posed canon lib addressed through exclusions, by the so-called TERFs, and no platforming, by their trans rights opponents. The labor aristocracy theory was derived from Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism but considerably exaggerated from that text. It was taken to explain right-wing control of trade unions and the idea which was interrelated to the concept of surrounding the cities, peasants the true revolutionary class, or, globally, Third World first, and also formed the foundation of privilege theory, whether white privilege, or male privilege, or the plausibility of privilege theory in fact remains dependent on the plausibility of hard labor aristocracy theory. And this was always seriously problematic. The labor aristocracy were the skilled workers who were able to organize early and extract higher wages from employers. Engels in the 1880s-1890s identified these as the social base of the apolitical right wing in the British trade union movement. Lenin adopted this view of Engels's to explain the ascendancy of the social chauvinists in World War I. In reality, however, highly organized skilled workers are not consistently the right wing of the workers' movement, and on the other hand, the TNGWU, a general rather than a craft union, was a bastion of the right wing of the British labour movement between its 1922 formation and the 1950s. The labour aristocracy theory therefore lacks solid predictive value. Rather, it seems that successful workers' organization, whether of skilled or unskilled workers, attracts the managerial attention of capital and its state with a view to displacing or co-opting militant and leftist leaderships. For merely a single example, an interesting article by Barry Eadlin examines the history of the Teamsters in the 1930s to 40s, in which the right moved for state intervention against radicals of a sort which became more common post-war. Pro-capitalist interventions. The capitalist class consciously manages those below. It engages in divide and rule tactics, which is why, for example, managers want to retain discretion over to hiring and firing, limit the intervention of employment tribunals, etc. It is why they want to keep individual wage agreements private and do not like collective bargaining. Managers equally resist having to disclose sex, or race, or whatever, discrimination in pay precisely because they need to manage those below in every way they can. Part of managing those below is controlling trade union leaders either directly by paying them off or by putting in policemen, or by cultural or political incorporation. In return, the trade union bureaucracy is expected to manage the members. Both business and political managers for capital think consciously about how to manage those below. Regulatory regimes affecting labor are constructed with a view to facilitating this management. There may be, and usually are, carrots as well as sticks involved. In the USA, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, was passed in response to the strike wave which had begun earlier in the 1930s, with the aim of canalising worker dissent into more regulated structures. Accepting the carrot partial state legalization of trade unions carried with it the possibility and legitimacy of more intrusive regulation, as occurred with the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. It also implied more generally the legitimacy of judicial and state regulation of labor conflicts. Ruel Schiller in his 2015 book Forging Rivals shows, through a series of historical vignettes, how this framework of judicial and regulatory control already in THE 1940s. But pushing onwards through the 1950s 1970s, set up the conditions for litigation about race discrimination to be used to further undermine trade union independence. And for race and class to be posited as opposed issues but not to actually achieve an end to race discrimination. If trade unionism is to be business unionism which merely seeks a reallocation of the spoils of the firm's profits, but assumes that there must be profits. Gains for one section of the workers must be at the expense of other sections. Equally, if the judge is to be the savior from on high who will deliver the workers from the boss, or the black people from the whites, such oppositions are to be expected because, as I referred to earlier, judges are normally biased in favor of employers. The next step in this side of the story was the 1957 publication of Gary S. Becker's The Economics of Discrimination. According to Becker's introduction to the 1971 second edition, the book was originally only published due to the strong support of University of Chicago's Department of Economics, which pretty much says what needs to be said about its political purposes. The argument is essentially one which applies a pure subjective marginal utility analysis. In order to reach the conclusion that discrimination is against the interests of capitalists, whether as employers or as vendors of commodities, but arises from the preferences of consumers or workers. Becker provided an argument which supported the competition between workers' approach to discrimination issues. But it was in the 1970s that the positive idea of what has become rainbow capitalism emerged, initially in the political margins. Low-grade rightist science fiction writer G.C. Edmondson's 1980 book The Man Who Corrupted Earth has as its hero a buccaneering aerospace entrepreneur hero Gus Dampier, who has a black business partner Albert, who plays up to racist assumptions by pretending to be Gus's chauffeur as protective coloration. This team sends a young black man and a young white woman into space to prospect the asteroids for minerals using reconditioned decommissioned space shuttles which have been left in orbit, plus solid rocket boosters. For funds, the heroes team up with a Gulf state princeling Mansar, who has saved up the millions from his allowance, which he has pretended to spend on high living. The whole theme of the book, whose plot and characterizations are ultra clunky, is the capitalist hero of anti-discrimination. Gus shook his head in disbelief. Why couldn't they, a federal agency, have just asked me? Albert, oh, they never asks us minorities. They always know what's good for us. Mansar began to suspect that some of the subtleties of American dialect might be eternally beyond him. Mr. Dampier is of a minority? He asked. Albert, or Gus, how many of us millionaires you think there are in the United States? Edmondson is transparent because his writing is crude. But the basic idea was far more widespread. Anti-discrimination, if coupled with anti-statism, can be a banner for the protection of the rights of the ultra-rich and of corporations. The Libertarian Party was founded in Colorado in 1971 on just such a platform. Western U.S. small L libertarian rightism went partway down this road. Pure rightist cynics, like SF writer Jerry Pournelle, 1933-2017, did so in High Justice, 1977, and Exiles to Glory, 1978, though the large bulk of Pournelle's writing is far more traditionalist on gender roles, and so on. For a couple more SF examples, Larry Niven's short story Arm, 1975, set in a liberal rather than libertarian future, adds trans rights, while anarcho-capitalist L. Neil Smith's The Probability Broach adds animal rights. In short, it was already obvious to at least some free market rightists by the time of the 1977 Costa Rican Colónes statement that anti-discrimination ideas could be deployed for pro-capitalist projects. U.S. defeat in Vietnam brought the equalities agenda from the margins to the center. The black civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s fed almost seamlessly into the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s-1970s. It was a notable feature of the war that black youth were disproportionately conscripted and sent to the sharp end, and that the U.S. Army was marked by a mainly white officer corps presiding over a mixed-race rank and file. By the 1970s, the extent of general opposition to the war and the race issue within the U.S. Army were leading to a real crisis, both of the draft, and of military discipline in the field. In April 1975 the US scuttled out of Saigon, and the open recognition of defeat in Vietnam became inevitable. It was in the late Vietnam and post-Vietnam period that the US armed forces began to take seriously the issues of anti-discrimination, beginning with race. If they could not get over the wrong war problem, and had to be cautious with Vietnam syndrome, they could at least deal with the race issue, which had radically exacerbated their problems. With the State Corps, the armed forces, moving on the issue. Resistance to formal anti-discrimination measures more widely faced considerable difficulties. The anti-discrimination agenda also actually fitted well with the more general project of neoliberal financial globalization and Francis Fukuyama's 1992 The End of History. Thomas Friedman's 1999 The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and all the other similar apologetic products. Anti-discrimination sold the free market as going along with other forms of freedom. At the end of the rainbow. At the end of the rainbow is a pot of gold, not. The labour rights statesmanship in defending the Union in the Scots independence referendum in 2014 produced a nationalist landslide in 2015 and a Scots Tory revival in 2017. The Clintonistas polemic against the Sanders camp, that only their rainbow alliance of the various women, ethnic groups, and so other oppressed, with Wall Street money could beat Trump, got its comeuppance when Trump won, in doing so winning several old working class areas, and the Republicans obtained control of both houses of Congress. The clearest argument for why this should have happened has been offered by American scholar Walter Ben Michaels. In short, since the turns of the late 1970s 1980s towards financial globalization and human rights and anti-discrimination, economic inequality has sharply increased. Michaels looks at the distribution of household income in the U.S. in 2015 by quintiles. For example, 6% of U.S. households earn more than $200,000 a year, but only 2% of blacks, 45% earn less than $50,000 a year, but 61% of blacks. If race discrimination was got rid of, since black people are around 13.2% of the U.S. population, they would form 13.2% of the very rich, and so on, and 6% of black people would be in the top quintile. 45% in the bottom quintile. The point is thus made graphically obvious that the point of eliminating horizontal inequality is to justify individual inequality. And this is why some of us have been arguing that identity politics is not an alternative to class politics but a form of it. It's the politics of an upper class that has no problem with seeing people left behind as long as they haven't been left behind because of their race or sex. Equality of opportunity anti-discrimination discourse blames the victims of economic inequalities. They had the opportunities but didn't take them unless they can claim that their victimhood is the result of race or other discrimination. It is a natural consequence that there should be a growth of white identity politics and male identity politics among poorer white Americans. This politics is merely people who cannot make an anti-discrimination claim as black, or whatever, applying the methods of the rainbow ERS to themselves. The point is not that white or male identity politics is a meritorious point of view. It isn't. The point is, rather, that the result vote Clinton, get Trump was the natural and probable consequence of the rainbow alliance with Wall Street. The People's Front policy, and that the epistemological and moral claims of speaking bitterness and consciousness raising inherently logically imply that U.S. white men have the right to self-define themselves as oppressed. And then the practical result is that we not only get Trump, but also get at least one far-right extremist, Neil Gorsuch, on the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the actual sovereign in the U.S. Constitution, and are likely to get another even if Brett Kavanaugh is in the end not approved. On this basis, intersectionalism's refusal of class issues in the hope of alliance with the Democratic wing of capital defeats its own non-class objects. The intersectionalists will have achieved not only savage attacks on the working class as such, but also the impending reversal of Roe v. Wade in abortion rights, of affirmative action programs, and so on.